Okay, so in week 8, we're going to be talking about safeguarding and protecting children. I want to make sure that I remind you that your community resource reflection on Safe Home Rape Crisis Center is going to be due by March the 10th, so don't forget about that. So, historically speaking, safeguarding or protecting or advocacy for the safety of children and proper treatment has actually been relatively new. In the New York Society of Prevention for Cruelty of Children, it was modeled after an organization set to protect animals, like the PETA organization protects animals. So that actually preceded child abuse laws and child prevention of child cruelty. The actual official laws put into effect weren't until the 1960s. That's really, really late to have laws saying you can't harm children. And it's really interesting to think of the fact that less than 100 years ago, children were seen basically as little adults and were put into the workforce, the adults' environment workforce, basically at the early age of 7. That's just amazing to imagine that. But things, fortunately, have changed quite a lot. Anytime we focus on the well-being of children and what we might do to foster that well-being, attachment theory should be a part of our conversation. There's ways to physically keep children safe, and there are ways of emotionally and psychologically keeping children, quote, safe. And so attachment's a really good framework to be able to do that. Attachment could be thought of as the quality of bond between infant and caregiver, and I've discussed before the 4 S's of secure attachment. Safe from threat or from direct harm, the child feeling seen, not just physically, but seen innerly or emotionally. The child feeling soothed during moments of intensity. That doesn't mean coddling, right? That's a difference of coddling versus soothing. Soothing is recognizing where the child is and in a truthful and honest way help them manage the intense emotions that they feel in whatever given situation it is. And the 4th has security. That means basically a general sense of I'm okay or of well-being. Even if things are hard or if difficulties come about, in general, I'm still okay. And something else that I've briefly mentioned before that most of you have probably seen is the 5 elements of secure attachment-oriented caregiving. Now, what that really means is 5 things or 5 emphases, 5 things that we emphasize as caregivers that can foster or more likely cultivate a sense of secure attachment in children through our interactions. Remember, our interactions, our relationships are the tools which we're going to be teaching children and helping them develop emotionally as well as physically. Contingent communication, in a nutshell, means that the one person takes into account all of what could be occurring in the other person's experience before responding to it. Okay, so that includes all of the nonverbals, and it basically is an extension of what you might think of as the deferred judgment of active listening. Contingent communication basically means that you hold off before making assumptions until you gather all that you can notice about the other person in terms of what emotionally is going on in them. I put a document on Blackboard, I think the first week, where these 5 things are kind of highlighted and explained a little bit. And in the contingent communication section, there's a description of it being basically like reading the emotion in the other and matching yours to that emotion, somewhat like dancing in the music of the mind. And I kind of like that idea that the emotion that hasn't really been expressed yet, but that you can kind of read or sense through nonverbals, is thought of as like music, and your behavior in reference to that or contingent upon that is something like you're dancing to it. Secondly, reflective dialogue. The term reflective is used because we act as an emotional mirror to the child in interactions. So I am going to not only observe nonverbals and respond appropriately like in contingent communication, but I'm actually going to express what I see to the child to help them make sense of what it is that they're feeling. So seeing nonverbals, simple examples of like seeing the saddened face and hearing the kind of distressed tone of voice in a child, you might reflect to them or act as an emotional mirror to them in stating out, you seem to feel really sad right now, or you seem to miss whoever just left, or you seem to be really upset. And you seem to is a useful thing to start with, because they can correct you, and that's okay. If we didn't get it quite right and they say, no, I don't feel that way, I feel this way, that's better, because we're helping them differentiate the different emotions that they're experiencing. Now, all of these sort of overlap and extend into one another, but emotional communication is simply the direct description of emotion with emotional vocabulary. And that can actually be a little bit more self-focused. So as a parent or caregiver, stating out to a young child what it is that's going on within me helps them understand not only what they might be going through too, or what emotions they might be experiencing, but also how to read others. It's a little bit like, this is how I'm feeling, and it gives them a chance to test, yeah, I kind of thought that, so I was right about that. Or I didn't see that at all, so that they may be able to figure out what nonverbals are there. Now this is not something that, especially infants, but young children in general, are really going to be able to cognitively or intellectually think out. This is more of a subliminal and intuitive, implicit kind of attitude that we're taking when we think about these things. Coherent narrative refers to a steady and cohesive sense of self from who I was in the past to who I'm headed to be in the future. It refers to kind of the story we see ourselves as living out, and sharing that story as a member of a child's life is really important to help them construct their own story of themselves, their own sense of who they are. Now, when all of these things are possibly forgotten, and in a moment of reactivity, I, the adult or caregiver or parent, lose my temper, for instance, right, which happens to everybody, and there's a certain rupture in the interaction in which none of these things are happening, there's just reactivity, just intense emotion on the adult's part. That doesn't mean that you've damaged, the relationship for good. What it means is that there's an opportunity to repair. Repair basically means to come back and explain or describe what happened to the child in such a way not to make an excuse for anything, but actually maybe to even provide an opportunity to apologize if it's necessary, even as the adult. That doesn't mean that you simply whimper in front of the kid. Excuse me again, my dog is barking at me. It doesn't mean that you just whimper at the kid or apologize for everything. It basically means that you recognize fully and confidently and honestly what it is that occurred, and tell the child where you feel like you could have done something different. And it allows them to see that it's okay to mess up. It's okay to have moments of irritation and upset, but to come back to it and to learn from it is the important part. So for the practice portion of this week's assignment, of this week's lesson, think about the secure attachment information that I just went over from the previous few slides. And also think back to the active listening components, that of paying attention, demonstrate that attention, provide feedback, defer judgment, and responding appropriately. And then I want you to take that information and go out into the world, and whatever your week looks like, and in interactions with children, or if you don't see children that much, interactions with other adults, and try to come back to some of those active listening skills and to use as many of them as you can. They're going to be really central to communicating in general, but also try to pick at least one of the elements of secure attachment that we just went over, right? So the elements of contingent communication, reflective dialogue, emotional communication, coherent narrative, and repair. Try to use one of those or emphasize one of those in your communication style with a child or with adults. And then record some short phrases you found yourself using, actual verbal sentences that you found yourself using that you felt were good examples. And then write a little bit of a reflection as a discussion post, describing that experience, and particularly note if it was hard to do or not. Sometimes it can be, to change the mode of communication that you have. And then I want you to reply to at least one other post. All right, so shifting gears slightly, we're talking more specifically about certain types of safety, mental health in general, physical well-being. Access to health services is a really central part of maintaining physical safety and well-being. In addition to the physical environment, providing a safe physical environment. And when we discuss things like wellness may include things like food insecurity, which basically refers to not having enough food. There's an insecurity in this child's mind in the way that they might expect to get food whenever they can, and when they do have food, what quality of food is it? If they're getting the proper nutrition they need, and that can weigh into or overlap with the issue of obesity, where if you're not eating proper nutrition, you might be eating a lot of things that could lead down the road of poor physical health, including things like obesity. In conjunction with that, a lessened level of physical activity and exercise. And then, of course, there's always the issue of substance abuse at a certain age. Now, with young children, the substance abuse issues may come a little bit more from the other people in their lives, other adults or other older children, but is nonetheless possibly a part of their lives. And sex education becomes more and more of an important thing. And sex education doesn't just mean procreation education. It means in reference to things like proper or appropriateness of physical contact, right? So letting a child know what's appropriate and what's not, so that they know when things occur in their lives that they should actually try to get help for. So kind of carrying along with that, abuse and neglect. So technically we might think of neglect as the failure to provide needed and age-appropriate care. That's physical care, emotional care, educational, and medical care. And failure to do that is what we refer to as neglect. Physical abuse is basic, straightforward harm in terms of in violent harm. And in our worlds, what we're looking for is possibly resulting injuries or other types of more psychological signs that that type of physical abuse is occurring. Now, emotional abuse, I think we can think of that as being pretty specific, a way that a child might be led to feel inadequate, unloved, or worthless. That refers to the self-view that they have, the way that the child sees who they are. That's really what emotional abuse deteriorates. Okay, they come to see themselves as being not worthy, as being less than, as being inadequate, and so on. And so there are lots of ways that an adult might lead a child to feel that way through the ways that they use words, the ways that they use the tone of voice even, things like that. And then child sexual abuse, very straightforwardly, is any form of sexual contact or activity by an adult or another child in a position of power or influence. And so that last part maybe isn't always the way we think about child sexual abuse, but an older child who's not yet an adult can also inflict sexual abuse on a young child. Now, violence and bullying in a child's life. This is just hitting a few thoughts about about the fact that these things do occur in children's lives. There's lots of depth to go into each of these topics, but domestic violence is often fairly secretive in a child's life, and it can be really, really important to be as careful as possible in reading subtle signs of how a child experiences their home life and whether or not someone's being harmed, and whether or not especially that child is aware of it, or especially whether or not they observe it or witness it. Any form of bias and prejudice especially that a child is really aware of, that ties in with emotional abuse, but more maybe outside of the home. And any bullying, of course, that means the continual and deliberate attempts to hurt, frighten, or intimidate a weaker person, or a person of a position of weaker or less power, say. There are not just bullies and those who are bullied in a bullying situation. There are also bystanders, so those who are around and who notice it or who are aware of it but don't do anything. Or have the opportunity to intercede and don't. There are other types of dangerous adults, we might call them, people who might influence children very negatively or directly harm them, and we might be the gatekeepers in that child's life in that way. So that's something we need to keep in mind. Now, thinking about media for a moment, it was remarkable at the time of the publication of our text that it was referenced that an average child watches about 10,000 to 15,000 of hours of TV before the age of 18. It's a tremendous amount of time. And in more current media or entertainment environments, we have lots of communication and social gatherings, so to speak, in an internet setting. And when a person gets on the internet, they feel themselves to be acting out what's called an avatar, and you probably know what the avatar is, like the little circle on the top of your email screen where your picture is. That's called technically an avatar, but what it might refer to is the sense of a change of self in the internet space. So like when children play video games that are first-person video games, like the big one, of course, is Fortnite. When anyone is a part of that game, there's a high tendency for people to assume a different type of personality, at least slightly, and that's seen in the ways that you might read posts and things on social media that don't seem as though people really think before they put it up there. It's like if you're in traffic and someone cuts you off and you scream at them and yell at them and make rude gestures to them and things, that probably wouldn't be a reaction that you would make in their face, right, for person to person. And that distance of being in another car moving along makes us act differently. Now, the distance in internet space is so vast that at times people act just wildly different than who they are. And when this comes into play, things like cyberbullying can be really easily come up. Because there would be so little forethought on what influence a certain comment might have on others. And so that's a big problem. So it's something we need to really pay attention to. In addition to that, there's a wide resource of all kinds of things on internet resources that some of which are very inappropriate for children, but sometimes things are marketed to children that are either on the line of being appropriate for them or maybe not appropriate at all. So a part of the way that we might help protect children that expands out away from the classroom or the home setting includes other institutions and organizations like religious institutions, different types of civic services, even businesses and things like that. When we focus out into the community, there are actually lots of different circles in which children are going to be influenced heavily. Okay, so for your demonstrate portion of this week, what I want you to do is similar to one of the first week's assignments of movie script, but in this case, I want you to focus in on a hypothetical interaction with adult and child, and provide comments that kind of analyze the dialogue or the interaction in brackets and in bold print. I've given you an example on the PowerPoint. And I want you to really try to pour in as many aspects of active listening and secure attachment-oriented caregiving. So kind of base it on what you might have experienced in the practice portion, but I really just want you to try to pack it in as much as possible. Try to hit every active listening component. Try to put as many of the secure attachment-oriented caregiving things in there as possible. So, like I said, model this after the movie script, but you've had a lot more experience thinking about how communication works in a child and adult interaction. So really try to put more into it than that first go-round. As I put in the example, I've mentioned a teacher kneeling down to speak calmly with a young girl. The kneeling down would be paying attention and demonstrating that based on the posture of the teacher. The speaking calmly with a young girl might be an example of like deferring judgment. So there may be something that the teacher actually feels upset about, because the girl in this example is just throwing something at another child. And then there's examples of like providing feedback and reflective dialogue and so on. If you have any questions about those components, those components of active listening or secure attachment-oriented caregiving, then feel free to give me an email or text me or give me a call or something. Okay? Sorry, I'm trying to kick the dog to hush him up. That's it, though, and remember to submit your community resource reflection about Safe Homes Rape Crisis Center by the 10th, and then, of course, as usual, your QQC and self-reflection. Okay? Have a good week, and reach out to me if you need to.